Hello and welcome. It is such a wonderful opportunity to be able to tell my story. I am honored to share with you the teachings and principles of the Alexander Technique, which have changed my life in so many ways. Like so many music students in their first years of college, I experienced a performance-related injury playing the violin. It started with neck and back pain, which I thought was probably normal, playing the violin and being in college, never quite figuring out how to manage my time, never eating enough or sleeping enough. So of course I kept practicing. But my pain got worse and started shooting pains down into my shoulder, down into my arm, and I started having numbness in my fingers and a lack of control, sort of clamming up fists uncontrollably. So I sought medical advice and doctors recommended that I quit playing the violin, which I didn't want to hear, and so I continued practicing. Throughout this presentation, I'll explain a lot about the importance of the head being balanced over the spine, as you can see on the right, and what it looks like when it's not balanced. Your left, and what it's not balanced on the right. And so what I did to myself for years and years, which caused my injury. When I finally got an MRI, it was determined that I have a bulging disc in my cervical spine, that being the top part of the spine. Right about where the violin is, actually. The bulging disc was pressing against nerves, which causes shocking pain down the arm, numbness, and altered reflexes. So finally, my symptoms made sense, but the question was, how can I heal and will I ever be able to play the violin again? I've heard of the Alexander technique. If you do any research about pain or injury, you'll see plenty of information about it. I did finally quit playing and started reading a lot about the Alexander technique, but for years my pain continued, and it seemed there was nothing I could do to learn the Alexander technique through books and no amount of book reading that would help me to understand. Until I finally had a lesson with an Alexander technique teacher. The lesson simplified everything I was going through and helped me to understand why I couldn't learn it through books, because it's very difficult to understand what you're doing with yourself without help. It causes a lot of frustrations. Alexander put it well when he said people do not decide their futures, they decide their habits. I decided a future as a violinist, but my habits decided for me that my future would look much different. My story is very similar to anyone who experiences chronic pain. In fact, my story is similar to the creator of the technique. His full name was Frederick Matthias Alexander. I love that his initials indicate the way of being that he encouraged us to adopt and master, to be forever mindful in our actions. He was a Shakespearean actor in England since the late 1800s. His career was interrupted due to a tendency to lose his voice during performances. He became prone to hoarseness and respiratory troubles that would affect the quality of his voice. He sought medical advice, and they gave him some medicines and only advised him to rest when performing for a time. But he found no real relief. And so, figuring that what was bothering him only happened when he was performing, he set out to determine what it was he was doing with himself. To put it the way he did, he set out to observe his use of self. Let's define use as any habit which influences our balance or coordination. This includes mannerisms, postures, and intentions. Misuse can therefore be defined as anything which disturbs the body's poise, balance, or coordination, affecting the entirety of the functioning body. And define function as our ability to move according to the body's design. These definitions lead us to what F.M. Alexander referred to as the universal constant, how our use affects our functioning. How we sit, stand, move, all have an impact on the quality of our functioning. He took time to observe his use, observing himself in a mirror, and realized he did certain things when he was performing that were drastically different than when he was normally speaking. He would throw his head back and down, which would cause his larynx to be depressed, and was causing him to gasp for breath forcefully. And he didn't realize he was doing this unless he was paying close attention to himself in the mirror. So he determined that we all sort of have a false sense of what we're doing, which he called faulty sensory appreciation. Taking time to observe his use, he then took time to pause for habitual responses, which he called inhibition. To take a moment and pause from your first instinct. And then to move into a more useful direction, into a more useful action, he called direction. Conscious control is what he called taking responsibility for the use of self, through using these principles of inhibition and direction. It's a very unique method in that a lot of methods for wellness are either mind-focused or body-focused. The Alexander technique is very much about both, which he calls psychophysical unity. It describes the interconnectedness of our whole being and how the mind affects the body, and so too does the body affect our mind and emotions. He said, "You think my work is a physical thing, for people often think that the Alexander technique is just about posture, but it's perhaps the most mental thing that's been discovered, for indeed it's a lot of mental work to discover what it is that you're doing with yourself." In this lecture, I'm aiming to help students of the violin be able to treat or prevent injury by using these techniques of becoming aware of, inhibiting, and directing habitual responses. However, the Alexander technique is for anyone who moves. It's about movement, why we move, and how we move. So, it's particularly helpful to musicians because they move for a living, just like dancers and athletes, who often forget how much they use their body, getting so caught up in their instruments, literature, pedagogies, histories, and theories, they never learn how or forget to take care of their bodies. In beginning to learn the Alexander technique, it's very helpful to understand that humans are designed to move with an instinct to move in a natural and coordinated way. It's very easy to see how durable and flexible the human body is when observing toddlers learn to walk. When they're learning how to walk, their entire organism is focused on a heavy head being balanced over the spine. They fall repeatedly and stand back up with strong legs, everything focused on the head leading them up, without a single thought about it. What happens is perhaps a bunch of learned habits that cause our inherent coordination to diminish into a collection of not so useful habits, as we endure much sitting through schools and forget or are taught how to take good care of our bodies. One way of learning about the body to understand its mechanics for successful movement is called body mapping. It's an internal representation we all have in our minds about how we move. And this representation may not be correct, and we call that mismapping. So accurate maps can help create good movements, and mismapping can cause a lack of coordination due to a lack of understanding how things work. A common mismap has to do with the spine, which is our core center of our body. It's not our back. Another mismap has to do with where the spine meets the head. And many people would just say the neck, but that doesn't quite give you an accurate description of where the primary movement is for the head. The top vertebrae is called the atlas, and the base of the skull, which is called the occipital, meet at the atlanto-occipital joint, or AO for short. If you were to put your fingers in your ears, you'd be pointing right at it. It's much higher up than most people think. So the head weighs a lot, 8 to 15 pounds. And so if it's balanced over the spine in a way that's healthy, all the discs in between protect the vertebrae from each other. But for every inch that the head falls off this balance, it causes 10 pounds worth of pressure onto the spine, causing damage to the nerves as the weight falls onto the nerve part of the spine. One reason for the imbalanced body, the imbalanced head, is called the startle reflex, and it's a natural reaction that we're all born with, a reaction to fear. It causes the stronger muscles in the back of the neck to contract and pull the head back and down. And though it's a natural reaction to fear, we begin to have this reaction often throughout our days as worry, anxiety, and depression manifest similarly. Many students and teachers of the Alexander technique have observed that most people live every day in a modified version of this startle reflex. So what those babies have that we have lost, perhaps, if our head is falling out of balance, F.M. Alexander called it our primary control, the relationship between the head, neck, and torso. It is a relationship, it's not a position. It's not, we're born with it, we all have it, and it's not something that you do, it's something that you allow to happen. It can be defined as the main organizer of the whole body, because when the head moves, the entire body is affected. And so when this relationship is working well, we have this feeling of our head going forward and up. When the head moves forward and up, the spine lengthens. And when the head pulls back and down, the spine shortens. And over time, we begin to feel comfortable in this position of what we call downward pull. And gravity will pull you farther and farther down. It begins to feel comfortable to be in this position of downward pull. And so, when learning the Alexander technique, many people experience the same sort of false sense of themselves that Alexander experienced when he was observing himself in the mirror, that she called faulty sensory appreciation. It's a distortion of the senses, and what feels right is your habit, not necessarily how your body was designed to move. Remember that you're not always doing what you think you're doing, and so this is why it's very important to work with a teacher, as they can help you to observe any misuse that you're having or any faulty sensory appreciation to help you discover what it is that you're doing with your body. And just trying to discover that on your own can be very frustrating and cause more misuse. We often go through our days for years and years of our lives, never paying attention to what we're doing with our body. To pay attention to the processes needed to achieve a goal, F.M. Alexander called the means whereby. It's the how and how a person uses themselves. And if we're not paying attention to the processes needed, we could be doing any number of things which is causing harm to the body. A good example, a personal example, is music students practicing from beginning to end over and over again, eager to master a piece of music or anxious about an upcoming performance. This would be called end gaming when you're not paying attention to what you're doing, not paying attention to processes. It's a grasping for results without attention to the process. So means whereby is the process, and end gaming is just an attempt to get straight to the goal. Remember when Alexander took time to observe his use, and he paused from the misuse, and he called this inhibition. And directions is what he called moving into a new, more useful action. And so in learning the Alexander technique, we have to inhibit, pause from our end gaming, to pay attention to our means whereby our processes, and direct ourselves into better use. This is what he meant by conscious control, to take responsibility for the use of self. This will lead us into the next section about injury, treatment, and prevention. Many people are unaware of how common injury is amongst musicians. So let's first see the prevalence of injury in violinists and violists. This was a survey done for medical problems of performing artists. 189 violinists and violists were surveyed, and 22% of them experienced minor pain, 53% of them experienced nearly or debilitating pain on a regular basis. But 75% of the surveyed professional workers. Violinists and violists play almost constantly in the orchestra, and this leads them to playing up to 30 hours a week in just concerts and rehearsals, which can last up to 3 hours. This is besides the unknown amount of time they spend at home practicing, but they may be a part of chamber groups, they may play in churches, and also teach. That's why violinists and violists often suffer these common injuries, usually beginning with neck and back strain, but it can often lead into worse situations like tendonitis or nerve entrapment. Nerve entrapment is when certain areas, usually around joints, the nerves get trapped in these areas. For violinists and violists, it happens often in the thoracic outlet nerve, in the ulnar nerve here, the carpal tunnel nerve here. Rotator cuff impingement occurs often due to the raising up of the shoulder to meet the instrument. There are so many little muscles and so many little bones in this area, and they get inflamed, and it makes it difficult to then raise or lower the arm in position other than where it used to be for violinists and violists. Very much stuck here. Injury to the cervical spine can also occur with the head being tilted towards the instrument, causing the weight to go onto that nerve-bearing part of the spine. Radiculopathy is where the bulging disc hits the nerves and affects the control of the arm. And degenerative spine disease is when the discs become damaged over time from the head not being balanced well. It causes damage to the discs between vertebrae. In treating injury, people seek many methods for relief: massage therapy, chiropractic, physical therapy, or ultimately massage. The Alexander technique is very complementary to medical treatment. Its unique contribution is education. It teaches us about pain and where it comes from, and that it's a response signal to a problem. So it helps us to understand where this problem is. It also teaches us about psychophysical unity, that thought processes can have a significant impact on our well-being. And so then we learn that reactionary responses can intensify injury due to the nature of tensing up when you're in pain and can cause further damage to where the original problem was. Those seeking prevention for injury would do well to learn these mental steps of the Alexander technique, to become aware of habitual responses, inhibit or pause from them, and direct the body into more useful action. We have to avoid infighting, and as violinists and violists in particular, we have to practice the support of our instrument, which is so important, as we'll be spending many hours a day for many years of our lives playing the instrument. And this can include the adjusting of our equipment. We have to take time to do that. By equipment, I mean the shoulder rest and chin rest. Well, the shoulder rest can become a stiff obstacle, which we feel we have to wrap our body around. If we could think of it instead as a collarbone rest, as this is the primary area of support, rather than thinking that we put it on our shoulder, this would help a lot. Then we bring the instrument into our space, rather than thinking to wrap the body around it. As for the chin rest, the entire head, neck, jaw area should be able to move freely along this area, never stuck in one place. And so maybe we should call it a head rest, to prevent us from thinking our chin and our shoulders somehow to come together over this instrument. There are so many options of chin and shoulder rest. We just have to take time to adjust equipment and experiment with new devices. And learning to support the instrument in a way that's healthy for the body, it's very helpful to understand the places where the instrument comes into contact with us. Remembering that we're going to now call this a collarbone rest, and think that the collarbone is just a shelf for the instrument to sit on. And then the head can rest on it wherever it's naturally going to nod down, now that we know where our AO joint is. And now that we know that the head weighs 8 to 15 pounds, there's no need to put any pressure at all, no force from the head. Just that you can nod it down, and that's enough to keep the instrument from falling. The side of the neck sort of cradles the instrument and should feel very comfortable there. We don't need to jam it in there, chin to shoulder, none of that. That is our collarbone, our head, side of the neck. But also these areas will have to work very hard if we don't allow a little bit of support from the left hand. In fact, the left hand thumb is a bit of an upward pressure to the downward pressure of the fingers. And so if you find that this instrument can sit very gently on the collarbone and nod down, it should be a very easy act. And if it isn't, I think all we should have to do is take time to adjust this equipment. And we also have to practice this support. It's hard to find exactly the right way to do it, but just like any scale or song, we have to practice it. Avoiding infighting, just rushing to learn a piece of music. To remember that this instrument is very light, and that we often think of it as fragile, expensive, incorrectly thinking of it as heavy. We hold on to it very tightly. But if we take time to just hold it, to feel it, to rest it on us, to not wrap our bodies around it, this is what I mean by practicing support and taking time to do this. The teachings of the Alexander technique have changed my life in an extraordinary way, not only helping me to heal from what felt like years and years of struggle with injury, but also to use these techniques in all aspects of my life. The learning psychophysical unity helped me so much in understanding that what began as a physical problem continued for years and years as a mental problem, as I was continuing to intubate, willing my body to get better already, and being very negative and upset about the whole situation. Learning how much the mind can affect the body, I had to give my mind and my body time to rest and to heal. And that helped me in so many ways. I believe deeply in the power of the Alexander technique to prevent injury, as so much of this would have helped me if I only had learned it sooner. I'm therefore very passionate about teaching this technique, especially to young people who have a hard time listening when they're so eager to play their instruments, especially as performance majors in college. But other than musicians, I believe anyone who moves can benefit in an extraordinary way from this technique. Thank you. want to?